Okay, now we are going to wrap up chapter 23 on Africa and wrap up the entire unit by taking a look now at some of the struggles in South Africa, particularly in the country of South Africa, but as well some of the smaller countries, Zimbabwe, for example, and maybe a couple other small countries in there. So in 1980, Southern Rhodesia, which of course no longer exists, became the nation of Zimbabwe. There's a lot of economic challenges, like many of them, caused by droughts and internal problems, which, of course, under the leadership of Mugabe and then later Nkomo, these one-party systems were helpful in crushing any kind of rebellions, but limiting any opposition to the rule. But this did not solve the economic and other problems, and the tension was still undercurrent. So a lot of violence over land ownership in South Africa, not only in the country of South Africa, but other South African countries because of as we mentioned a few times ago, the black African people, once they seized power from what were the colonial powers, they then seized the land, illegally took land back, and violently pushed the white farmers off their land. But specifically in the country of South Africa, there was a system called apartheid. Now that, as Americans, you're familiar with segregation in the South. This was a strict policy of apartheid in South Africa, where the government was white and there was segregation in the schools and in business. The black people in South Africa were very limited as far as their civil rights and their economic opportunities. This in turn led to very severe limitations on the educational opportunities as well. Due to pressure from the outside, particularly, apartheid came to an end fairly recently. But there were attempts made already in the 1960s by one Nelson Mandela, who began pushing with the ANC, the African National Congress, pushing for black rule of South Africa. And for his efforts, he was imprisoned for about 30 years in a very small prison cell. And this, in the 1980s, more and more protests became larger and larger, and even many of the white people in South Africa began realizing the abuses of apartheid. Many celebrities in America began holding concerts and other benefits to end apartheid in South Africa. Eventually, economic sanctions. The final white leader of South Africa was the F.W. de Klerk, who in 1989 became president and realized the gig was up as far as white ruling of South Africa, began to introduce some reform into their government. And by 1994, apartheid officially came to an end, and the black Africans were given equal civil rights. And in fact, the first thing they did do was elect the newly freed Nelson Mandela as the first black president of the modern state of South Africa. However, he was forced down in a scandal, as many of the leaders of African countries. So apartheid came to an end due to the resistance of the African National Congress, and F.W. de Klerk, although not as terribly keen on ending it, was forced into ending that system. In Namibia, also many struggles there with the SWAPO, the Southwest African Peoples Organization. This was a violent group that pushed for change there through not as peaceful as what Nelson Mandela pushed for. And also Angola and Mozambique are other countries in the continent of South Africa that suffered internal conflict and bitter civil wars, just like many of the others. So the outlook is still quite bleak for Africa. Each day, however, small steps are taken towards better educational opportunities. And again, most by private charity and organizations, as well as church groups, have brought some strides, but the government aid, outright aid, has gone to waste in many cases due to the corruption. Nelson Mandela was aided in his effort by one Desmond Tutu, who has since then became very famous for Nobel Peace Prize winner. And Nelson Mandela, after being ousted for scandals, went on the speaking circuit and died fairly recently, a year or so ago. And there was a very large state funeral, which I think our own President Obama even attended. So those are some things to finish up the chapter.